I walked into my son's spectacular new housewarming party wearing my best charcoal suit, feeling proud of the man he had become. My daughter-in-law, sipping from a crystal flute, pointed right at me and announced to a room full of millionaires that the caterers had mistakenly invited the old lawnmower. I froze, the humiliation burning my cheeks. As I turned to leave that toxic house forever, my son grabbed my arm, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered, "Easy. Dad, the real show hasn't even started yet." By the end of the night, she was the one being escorted out with nothing but a trash bag. Before I reveal exactly how we dismantled her entire life, let me know where you are watching this story from in the comments below. And hit that like and subscribe button if you believe greed always gets what it deserves. My name is Howard Bennett. I am 66 years old, and for the last 4 decades, I have built my life on 2 unwavering principles: silence and sweat. I am not a man who wears his bank account on his sleeve. To the untrained eye, to the snobby neighbors, and especially to my daughter-in-law Valerie, I am just a retired blue-collar worker who spent his life covered in dirt and grease. I drive a heavy-duty truck with 250,000 miles on the odometer. I wear thick work boots that have seen more mud than pavement. I never saw the need to broadcast the fact that I own one of the largest commercial development firms in the state. Wealth, true generational wealth, does not need to shout. It operates quietly in the shadows, moving pieces on a board no one else even knows exists. But Valerie was a woman who needed the whole world to hear her scream how important she was. She was 32, obsessed with appearances, designer labels, and social climbing. When my son Ian married her 3 years ago, I kept my mouth shut. A father learns that some lessons a son must figure out on his own. I just smiled, paid for the modest rehearsal dinner she complained about, and watched her slowly try to isolate Ian from his roots. It was a cool Saturday evening when I pulled my rusted truck onto the pristine driveway of their newly constructed suburban estate. The house was massive, a sprawling modern fortress of imported glass, black steel, and white stone that practically screamed new money. High-end luxury cars lined the meticulously paved street. I saw sleek Porsches, pristine Mercedes sedans, and vehicles that cost more than most people earn in a decade of hard labor. I parked 2 blocks down the street, intentionally keeping my battered truck out of sight, so I would not cause a scene or embarrass her precious aesthetic. I walked up the long, perfectly manicured path, taking in the landscaping. The irony was not lost on me. I knew the soil beneath my boots better than anyone. My company had legally acquired this entire tract of land 10 years ago. I had quietly leased this specific plot to Ian through a blind trust because I wanted him to build a home for his future family. Valerie thought they had bought it outright with her incredible business acumen. She had no idea the ground she stood on was technically still mine. I had put on my only custom-tailored suit for the occasion. It was a sharp charcoal gray classic and understated. I wanted to honor Ian on his big night. He had called me 2 days prior, his voice tense but determined, telling me this celebration was going to be a turning point. I had no idea I was walking directly into an execution chamber. The heavy oak front door was propped wide open, spilling warm golden light and the smooth sound of a live jazz quartet out onto the porch. I stepped inside the grand foyer. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catered seafood and heavy imported perfumes. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black ties floated effortlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar oysters and flutes of premium champagne. Everywhere I looked, I saw the elite of the city. Corporate executives, local politicians, and socialites dripping in diamonds and arrogance. And right in the center of it all, holding court by a massive imported marble kitchen island, was Valerie. She wore a silk designer dress that clung tightly to her frame, gripping her crystal champagne flute as if it were a royal scepter. She was laughing loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair back, commanding the absolute attention of 3 wealthy women I recognized from local lifestyle magazine covers. I stood near the entryway, quietly taking in the scene, searching the dense crowd for Ian. I did not want to intrude on her moment. I just wanted to shake my son's hand, give him a quiet nod of approval, and fade into the background. but then Valerie's sharp eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. I offered a warm, polite smile, raising my hand slightly, in a gentle gesture of greeting. Her smile vanished instantly. Her eyes swept over my charcoal suit, scanning my weathered face, my calloused hands, and my simple tie. I watched her face contort into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She did not walk over to greet her father-in-law. She did not pull me aside to welcome me to her new home. Instead, she raised her voice intentionally, projecting it over the smooth jazz music so that her affluent friends and anyone standing within a 20-foot radius could hear every single cruel syllable. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my chest. "Oh my God." She laughed, a high piercing sound that cut through the ambient noise of the room like a siren. I cannot believe the caterers mistakenly invited the old lawnmower inside. I specifically told the event planner to keep the outdoor maintenance staff in the back by the service entrance. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. The three women next to her stopped laughing mid-breath. Conversations around the kitchen island died instantly. Dozens of eyes turned to look at me, scanning my older, weathered face and my tailored suit, trying to figure out why a landscaper was standing in the foyer. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. The heat rushed to my cheeks. 40 years of building an empire, 40 years of breaking my back and bleeding into the dirt to ensure my son would never know a single day of hunger or poverty, reduced to a cruel punchline by a woman who had never worked a hard day in her entire pampered existence. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. My knuckles popped. Every protective, aggressive instinct I had developed in the cutthroat commercial real estate business told me to walk over there, reveal my true identity, and completely crush her arrogant facade in front of her high society friends. I could have ended her social standing with one sentence, but I remembered my golden rule. Silence is power. Reaction is weakness. I was not going to sink to her level. I was not going to make a pathetic screaming scene at my own son's housewarming party. I stopped dead in my tracks. I did not say a single word to defend myself. I simply turned my body back toward the heavy oak front door, ready to walk out into the cool night air. Get into my rusted truck and leave them to their hollow, superficial lives forever. My hand reached out for the heavy brass door handle. Before my fingers could even brush the cold metal, a firm, familiar hand clamped down incredibly hard onto my right shoulder. I froze. I turned my head slightly. It was Ian. He was wearing a dark navy suit, looking every bit the successful, powerful man I had raised him to be. But his face was tight. His jaw was clenched so hard, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He stepped close to me, placing his body directly between me and the doorway, physically blocking my exit. He leaned in his mouth just inches from my ear. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sudden sharp electric tension radiating from his body. "Easy, Dad," he whispered. His voice was incredibly low, completely steady and cold as absolute ice. "The real show has not even started yet." I looked deeply into his eyes. There was no embarrassment there. There was no pathetic apology for his wife's horrific behavior. There was only a burning, highly calculated intensity. It was a look I had taught him when he was just a young boy learning how to play chess at our old kitchen table. It was the look of a man who was already 3 moves ahead and simply waiting for his opponent to step directly onto the hidden landmine. He slowly released his grip on my shoulder and gave me a barely perceptible slow nod. I understood immediately. We were not retreating. We were hunting. I straightened my tie, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned my back to the door, facing the crowded room once again. We were going to let Valerie dig her own grave just a little bit deeper before we buried her in it. Ian did not say another word in the foyer. He simply placed his hand on the small of my back and guided me away from the kitchen island, away from the cruel laughter of the women holding their crystal champagne flutes. We moved through the throng of wealthy guests. The air was thick with the clinking of expensive glasses and the hollow chatter of people who only cared about their social status. We walked past the catering staff serving imported caviar and down a long, wide corridor adorned with modern art. I knew Valerie had purchased those paintings using my son's hard-earned money. The sheer scale of the house was magnificent, a testament to Ian's relentless work ethic. Yet walking down that hallway, the entire structure felt completely infected by the poison of her greed. We reached a heavy mahogany door at the very end of the hall. This was Ian's private home office. He pushed the door open, ushered me inside, and pulled it shut with a solid thud. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place instantly severed us from the noise of the party. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The office was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moonlight, spilling through the massive bay windows that overlooked the manicured backyard. Ian walked over to his heavy walnut desk and turned on a small brass reading lamp. The warm yellow light cast deep shadows across his face. He looked exhausted, carrying a physical weight that no man his age should ever have to bear. His shoulders, usually broad and confident, were tense. He knelt beside a concealed floor safe hidden beneath a thick Persian rug. The keypad beeped softly in the quiet room as he typed in the code. The heavy steel door popped open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy leather folder bulging with papers. He stood up, walked over to where I was standing, and placed the massive dossier directly into my hands. The leather felt cold and heavy, like a loaded weapon ready to be fired. I looked down at it, then back up at my son. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of all the naive love he once held for his wife. He told me to open it. He said I needed to see exactly who he had married, exactly what kind of predator we were dealing with, before we proceeded with our final plan. I unclasped the leather strap and opened the folder under the glow of the brass lamp. The very first page was a highly detailed bank statement from Ian's primary corporate account. It was a joint business account they had set up when they first got married, meant strictly for emergency operational expenses and tax reserves. I ran my calloused finger down the long column of transactions. Dozens of wire transfers carefully structured in increments just below the federal reporting threshold painted a terrifying picture of systematic, calculated theft. Valerie had not just been siphoning money to buy designer dresses, luxury handbags, or imported shoes. She had been bleeding my son dry to the tune of $500,000. Every single dollar had been funneled directly into a labyrinth of offshore accounts before landing in a completely fraudulent cryptocurrency venture. A venture owned and operated entirely by her younger brother, Cameron Lawson. I knew Cameron well enough to despise him. He was a smooth-talking con artist who wore flashy custom suits and constantly bragged about his digital investments, despite having never worked a legitimate, honest job in his entire life. The dossier contained hundreds of printed emails and intercepted encrypted messages between Valerie and Cameron. Reading through them made my stomach turn. She had been explicitly instructing him on how to bypass Ian's corporate accounting software. She had forged vendor invoices, fabricated supply chain receipts, and created completely fake consulting fees to justify the massive bleeding of cash. It was not a mistake. It was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was a highly organized, predatory financial extraction carried out over 18 months. She had looked her husband in the eyes every night, sat across from him at the dinner table, kissed him before bed, and methodically robbed him blind while he slept. She had treated his business as her personal slush fund to prop up her brother's sinking ship. I flipped to the next section of the dossier, feeling the familiar icy calm of absolute rage settling deep in my chest. This was the same cold focus I used when negotiating ruthless commercial real estate deals. Ian reached over and pulled out a single heavily stamped legal document from the back of the folder. He laid it flat on the desk, pressing his hand against the crisp paper. It was a freshly approved application for a massive secondary mortgage on the very house we were currently standing inside. The property that I had secretly leased the land for. The property Ian had poured his soul and savings into building for their future children. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. Ian's signature was there, rendered in perfect, flawless blue ink. Every loop and curve was an exact match. But Ian was looking at me with a terrifyingly blank expression. He quietly stated that he had never seen that document in his entire life until 2 days ago, when an automated alert triggered on his credit report. Valerie had perfectly forged his signature to pull out hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden equity. She was leveraging the roof over their heads to cover Cameron's collapsing digital Ponzi scheme before the federal regulators closed in. She was fully prepared to let the bank foreclose on her own husband, destroying his credit and his business just to save her criminal brother from prison. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. She had weaponized the sanctity of her marriage to strip my son of his entire financial future. I carefully closed the leather folder, the loud snap of the clasp echoing in the quiet room. I looked at Ian. The boy I had raised to be kind, trusting, and generous was gone. The man who had always tried to see the best in people had been violently murdered by his wife's greed. In his place stood a man who had stared into the abyss of absolute betrayal and survived. There were no tears in his eyes. There was only a cold, unyielding resolve to execute justice. I gave him a single sharp nod. The silent confirmation passed between us heavier and more binding than any spoken word. The financial trap we had spent the last 48 hours meticulously preparing was now fully armed and locked into place. Every legal snare was set. Every countermeasure was positioned perfectly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the specialized fountain pen. We had discussed placing it deliberately on the desk next to the forged mortgage papers. Ian checked his luxury wristwatch. I looked down at my own worn, scratched timepiece. We synchronized the exact minute. The trap would spring in precisely 1 hour. We took one last moment in the quiet sanctuary of the office, steeling ourselves for the carnage to come. We turned around, unlocked the heavy mahogany door, and walked back out into the bright, noisy hallway, stepping right back into the lion's den with the absolute certainty that we were the ones holding the cage keys. We stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the home office, and the noise of the party immediately crashed over us like a physical wave. The live jazz quartet in the corner had shifted to an upbeat, lively tempo. Waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating smoothly through the massive living room, carrying fresh trays of expensive champagne and imported hors d'oeuvres. No one in that room had any idea that the ground beneath their feet was fundamentally shifting. Ian and I separated slightly, blending back into the crowd of oblivious socialites, like two quiet ghosts. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water with lemon from a passing silver tray and positioned myself near a massive indoor ficus plant. I needed a clear, unobstructed vantage point for what was about to happen. I knew I would not have to wait long. Valerie was moving through the dense crowd with the predatory grace of a starving shark. She held a thick wooden clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. Her previous smile, the one she used to captivate her wealthy friends, was completely gone. It was replaced by a carefully manufactured mask of extreme annoyance. She was expertly playing the role of the overwhelmed hostess, dealing with tedious, last-minute administrative details. She locked her sharp eyes onto Ian across the room and marched directly toward him, cutting through groups of talking guests without a single polite "excuse me." I took a slow sip of my water and drifted a few steps closer, keeping my posture relaxed and my face entirely blank. I needed to see exactly what she was holding on that clipboard. She stopped abruptly, right in front of Ian, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh that was meant to convey deep exhaustion. She immediately began complaining that the private contractors hired to dig the new backyard swimming pool were being completely unreasonable and difficult. She claimed the local homeowners association was threatening to halt the entire excavation process on Monday morning unless they received a signed liability waiver immediately. She shoved the heavy clipboard directly into Ian's hands, tapping the bottom of the printed page impatiently with her manicured fingernail. She told him to stop socializing for 1 second and just sign the bottom line so she could scan the document to the association president and go back to actually entertaining their guests. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and perfectly designed to make a husband comply just to avoid a public argument. I was standing just over Ian's right shoulder, close enough to smell the expensive perfume radiating off Valerie. I have spent my entire adult life navigating the brutal, cutthroat world of commercial real estate and corporate acquisitions. I have read thousands of binding contracts, land grants, and property transfers. I did not need to read the tiny fine print at the bottom of the page to know exactly what was clipped to that board. The overall layout of the document, the specific spacing of the notary sections, and the bold black text centered at the very top gave it away instantly. It was absolutely not a routine liability waiver for a swimming pool. It was a rapid quitclaim deed. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her move was staggering. A quitclaim deed is a highly specific legal instrument to immediately transfer any and all ownership interest a person holds in a piece of real estate directly to another party. By signing that single piece of paper, Ian would be legally stripping himself of every single ounce of financial equity he had painstakingly built in this massive estate. He would be handing sole uncontested ownership directly over to Valerie, bypassing all standard marital asset division laws. She was actively trying to steal his home right in the middle of the very party meant to celebrate its completion. She was relying entirely on the chaos of the social event, the loud music, the flowing alcohol, and Ian's fundamental trust as her husband to push the paperwork through without him reading a single word. It was a sociopathic level of manipulation. I watched my son very closely. This was the most critical moment of our entire operation. If he hesitated for a fraction of a second, if he showed even a microscopic hint of suspicion, Valerie would instantly pull the document back and realize we were entirely onto her scheme. But Ian was absolutely flawless. He let out a tired, heavy sigh, perfectly mimicking an exhausted husband who just wanted his demanding wife to stop nagging him in front of his friends. He did not look at the top of the page. He did not question her false narrative about the pool contractors or the homeowners association. He simply nodded in defeat and reached slowly into the breast pocket of his tailored navy suit. He pulled out a sleek, heavy silver fountain pen. It was a beautiful, expensive-looking writing instrument, but it was not a standard pen. I had handed it to him in the quiet darkness of the home office just 10 minutes ago. The pen was a highly specialized tool I had acquired years ago through a private corporate security contact in Europe. It was originally designed for high-level corporate espionage and protecting sensitive trade secrets. The heavy silver barrel was loaded with a very specific, highly volatile chemical ink compound. When the ink first hits the paper, it flows thick, dark, and blue, looking exactly like standard premium legal ink. But the chemical composition is highly unstable when exposed to ambient room temperature and natural paper fibers. A precise molecular reaction begins the exact second the liquid dries on the page. The binding agents in the ink slowly break down completely, dissolving into the surrounding atmosphere. Within exactly 60 minutes of making contact with the paper, the dark blue strokes evaporate completely. They leave absolutely zero residue behind. There is no physical indentation on the paper, no faint chemical stain, no transparent outline. The document returns to a completely blank, pristine state. It is a literal ghost ink designed specifically to make legally binding signatures vanish into thin air without a single trace. Ian uncapped the heavy silver pen. He pressed the metal nib against the crisp white paper of the quitclaim deed. Valerie leaned in close, her breathing suddenly shallow. Her eyes locked completely onto the tip of the pen like a starving animal watching a fresh piece of meat. Ian signed his full legal name with bold, dark, sweeping strokes. The ink flowed perfectly onto the document. It looked undeniably permanent and legally binding. As he crossed the final letter of his last name, I watched a look of absolute terrifying triumph wash over Valerie's face. Her eyes gleamed with the pure, toxic thrill of having successfully robbed her own husband blind while he smiled at her. She did not even offer a fake thank you. She did not kiss his cheek or give him a polite smile of gratitude. The exact second the pen lifted from the page, she snatched the wooden clipboard out of his hands with astonishing, aggressive speed. She turned sharply on her expensive high heels and marched quickly away, holding the clipboard tightly against her chest, as if she had just stolen the royal crown jewels. She disappeared back into the loud crowd of laughing millionaires, completely unaware that she was clutching a rapidly ticking time bomb to her chest. She truly believed she had just secured her financial independence and ruined my son. Ian slowly capped the silver fountain pen and slipped it quietly back into his breast pocket. He turned his head slightly and met my steady gaze. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us said a single word. We just looked at each other with the cold, silent understanding of two men who had just watched a ruthless predator step blindly into a rusted steel jaw trap. I casually glanced down at the worn, scratched face of my heavy work watch. The time was exactly 8:15 in the evening. I watched the second hand tick forward with mechanical precision. The 60-minute countdown had officially begun, and Valerie's stolen suburban empire was already beginning to evaporate into thin air. The atmosphere in the massive living room shifted precisely as the antique grandfather clock in the hallway struck the half-hour. The catering staff began clearing the silver trays of half-eaten appetizers, seamlessly replacing them with towering tiers of imported desserts. The ambient hum of the party naturally migrated toward the center of the expansive estate, drawing the 70 wealthy guests like moths to a very expensive flame. The focal point of the magnificent room was a sweeping custom-built grand staircase. It featured imported mahogany treads and a hand-forged wrought iron railing that Valerie had spent the last 3 weeks bragging about on her social media pages. She positioned herself deliberately on the third step, physically elevating herself above her guests. She loved looking down on people just as much as she loved doing it financially. The bottom of the staircase was flanked by a literal mountain of wrapped boxes. There were towers of silver and gold, wrapping paper, massive silk ribbons, and designer shopping bags from exclusive boutiques I knew for an absolute fact Ian could not actually afford on his own. Valerie tapped her crystal champagne flute with a sharply manicured fingernail, demanding absolute silence. The live jazz band in the corner immediately stopped playing their instruments. The entire room fell quiet, the affluent crowd turning their expectant faces toward the supposed lady of the manor. She began her performance with a sickeningly sweet speech about how incredibly hard she had worked to design this perfect architectural sanctuary. She did not mention Ian's grueling 80-hour work weeks a single time. She then began the incredibly tacky process of opening her housewarming gifts in front of the entire audience, loudly announcing the brand names and origins of every single item to ensure everyone knew exactly how much money had been spent on her. There were heavy crystal decanters imported from Italy, pure silk throw blankets, and high-end espresso machines. Every time she unwrapped a box, she let out an exaggerated gasp of delight, blowing theatrical air kisses to the wealthy friends who had purchased her superficial affection. I remained standing near the back of the room, my arms resting loosely at my sides, watching the grotesque display of unchecked materialism unfold. I kept my face entirely neutral, betraying no emotion whatsoever. But Valerie, riding the dangerous high of being the undisputed center of attention, could not resist the overwhelming urge to twist the knife she thought she had planted in my back earlier that evening. Her sharp eyes scanned over the crowd of tailored suits and designer dresses until they locked directly onto my charcoal jacket. Her fake, radiant smile morphed instantly into a sharp, venomous smirk. She held a heavy crystal vase in her left hand and pointed directly at me with her right. She projected her voice so it echoed cleanly off the high vaulted ceilings, ensuring that not a single person in the room would miss her calculated cruelty. "Oh, look, everyone," she announced, her voice dripping with mock pity and condescension. "It seems my father-in-law has finally decided to join the actual party instead of hiding in the dark corners." The crowd parted slightly, creating a clear, highly uncomfortable path across the hardwood floor between where I stood and the bottom of the grand staircase. Valerie leaned forward over the iron railing, scanning my entirely empty hands with exaggerated theatrical disappointment. "I see you did not bring a box, Howard," she said, using my first name with a deliberate lack of familial respect. "I suppose we cannot blame you. I know how tight things can be when you spend your whole life pushing a lawnmower for a living. Maybe you can offer to trim the hedges out back as your contribution to our beautiful new home." A few nervous, highly uncomfortable chuckles rippled through her closest circle of socialite friends. but the vast majority of the 70 guests shifted awkwardly on their feet. Even among the ruthlessly wealthy, blatant disrespect toward an elder is considered terribly poor taste. I felt the collective pity of a room full of millionaires washing over me. They saw a tired blue-collar worker being publicly humiliated by a young, ruthless social climber. But they did not know what was resting securely inside the left breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. They did not know the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction I was carrying, just inches from my beating heart. I did not frown. I did not blush. I did not look at Ian, who was standing completely still near the hallway entrance, letting the plan play out exactly as we had orchestrated. I began to walk forward. I moved with slow, deliberate, unhurried steps. The crowd parted completely, stepping aside to clear a wide path to the staircase. I felt the smooth fabric of my suit jacket brush against my side with each step. Inside my pocket was a crisp, standard-sized manila envelope. It was not wrapped in shiny gold paper. It did not have a massive silk ribbon. It was plain, intensely practical, and devastatingly lethal. As I walked across the imported floors, my mind flashed back to the previous afternoon. I had spent 4 hours sitting inside the heavily soundproofed conference room of my corporate attorney, Owen Gallagher. My private investigators had cracked the incredibly sloppy financial shell game Cameron Lawson was running. Valerie's arrogant brother was a degenerate gambler masquerading as a visionary tech entrepreneur. His supposedly revolutionary cryptocurrency startup was nothing more than an empty digital void, a massive black hole of leveraged debt. He owed a staggering sum to a syndicate of ruthless underground lenders, men who did not send polite collection letters through the mail. He was entirely underwater, exactly 30 days away from total catastrophic default, relying entirely on the cash his sister was actively embezzling from Ian to keep his kneecaps intact. I did not report Cameron to the federal authorities immediately. That would have been too quick, too clean, and completely out of my hands. Instead, I instructed Owen to set up a brand new, completely anonymous shell corporation. Through complex back channels and corporate proxies, I legally purchased the entirety of Cameron Lawson's outstanding illicit debt. I paid a premium to acquire it quietly, but the cost was entirely irrelevant to me. The moment the massive wire transfer cleared yesterday afternoon, I became Cameron's sole uncompromising creditor. I held the absolute legal right to call in the entirety of the $1 million debt at a moment's notice. The manila envelope inside my pocket contained the official legally binding notice of immediate non-negotiable foreclosure on absolutely everything Cameron owned. It was a financial death warrant, a legal instrument that authorized the total seizure of his company servers, his bank accounts, and his personal assets. I reached the bottom step of the grand staircase. Valerie looked down at me, her chin raised high, her eyes filled with toxic triumph. She truly believed she had broken my spirit in front of her high society friends. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out the crisp manila envelope. I held it out toward her, keeping my hand perfectly steady. The plain brown paper looked completely out of place against the backdrop of shimmering crystal and silver gift boxes. Valerie stared at it, her arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second as she tried to calculate what a man like me could possibly be handing her. I looked her directly in the eyes. My voice was calm, completely stripped of any anger or malice, projecting clearly into the quiet room, so that only she and the closest guests could hear the exact phrasing. "I did not forget to bring a contribution to your new life, Valerie," I said smoothly. "In fact, I brought you exactly what your family deserves. I made sure to take care of the paperwork myself." I extended my arm slightly further, forcing her to lean down over the railing and take it from me. She snatched the envelope from my hand with a quick, dismissive jerk of her wrist. Valerie looked at the plain envelope with profound disgust. She pinched the corner of the heavy paper between two manicured fingers, treating it as if it were a piece of contaminated garbage. She did not open it. She did not pull back the metal clasp to look at the documents inside. She assumed it was a cheap gift card to a local hardware store, or perhaps a meager check drawn from a non-existent retirement fund. With a loud theatrical scoff designed to maximize my supposed public humiliation, she carelessly tossed the manila envelope right over her shoulder. It fluttered through the air and landed unceremoniously near the bottom of the massive pile of expensive, brightly wrapped boxes. I did not say another word to her. I simply gave her a polite, deeply hollow nod and turned around, walking slowly back toward the edge of the quiet crowd. Valerie instantly returned her attention to a massive box wrapped in heavy green velvet, laughing loudly as she ripped into the expensive packaging, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just discarded the most valuable and dangerous item in the entire house. I found my spot back near the indoor ficus plant and took another slow sip of my sparkling water. My pulse was completely calm and steady. The trap was locked. The ghost ink on the quitclaim deed was silently evaporating in the other room, and the corporate foreclosure notice was sitting right there in plain sight, a ticking time bomb buried under a mountain of stolen luxury. I watched the second hand on my worn watch continue its relentless mechanical march. The real show was moving inevitably closer, and the caterers were about to deliver the very first blow. I stood perfectly still near a massive indoor potted palm and watched the catering staff weave through the crowded living room. They were a highly efficient team, dressed in immaculate white button-down shirts and sharp black vests. They balanced heavy silver platters loaded with expensive imported delicacies that Valerie had specifically demanded for her grand showcase. There were fresh oysters resting on beds of crushed ice, tiny roasted quail portions, and delicate pastry desserts carefully dusted with edible gold flakes. The sheer astronomical cost of feeding 70 wealthy guests in this incredibly lavish manner was obvious to anyone with a basic understanding of high-end event planning. Valerie had spared absolutely no expense to ensure her affluent friends believed she truly belonged in their elite social circle. She was spending money like water flowing from a broken dam, entirely unaware that the reservoir had just been permanently drained. I shifted my gaze across the massive room to find Ian. My son was standing quietly near the long marble buffet table positioned at the edge of the formal dining area. His posture appeared perfectly relaxed, but his eyes were sharp and intensely focused. He held a glass of sparkling water and casually pretended to examine a large floral arrangement resting on the marble counter. A few feet away from him stood the head catering manager. He was an older man with thinning gray hair and a deeply serious, uncompromising expression. He held a sleek black mobile payment terminal gripped tightly in his right hand. I knew for an absolute fact that Ian had spoken to this specific manager privately earlier in the week. They had arranged this exact sequence of events down to the very second. Valerie was still standing triumphantly near the bottom of the grand wooden staircase. She was laughing loudly, with a tight circle of women wrapped in expensive silk designer dresses. She had just finished tearing the shiny wrapping paper off a heavy silver serving tray and was holding it up for everyone to admire. She was completely intoxicated by the attention and the perceived power of her stolen wealth. She threw her head back and let out another piercing laugh that echoed clearly over the smooth jazz music playing through the expensive hidden ceiling speakers. She believed she was the undisputed queen of the castle. She had absolutely no idea the executioner was already standing in the room. Ian caught the eye of the catering manager through the shifting crowd. My son gave a single microscopic nod of his head. It was a physical gesture so incredibly subtle that no one else in the room could have possibly noticed it or understood its devastating meaning. But the manager understood immediately. He turned sharply on his heel and walked directly toward the main audio control panel mounted on the wall near the swinging kitchen doors. The manager reached out and flipped the master audio switch downward. The smooth jazz music died instantly. It did not fade out politely or lower in volume. The sound was severed with a loud, harsh popping noise that reverberated brutally through the massive estate. The sudden absolute silence that crashed down on the room was jarring and deeply uncomfortable. 70 wealthy guests froze mid-sentence. People slowly lowered their crystal champagne flutes. Every single head turned toward the kitchen area to see exactly what had caused the rude disruption. The catering manager stepped forward into the center of the open hardwood floor. He did not look embarrassed by the sudden attention. He did not lower his voice to preserve the dignity of the hostess. He squared his broad shoulders and looked directly at Valerie, who was standing frozen on the first step of the staircase with the silver tray still in her hands. He projected his voice clearly and loudly across the dead silent room. He announced that he needed to speak with Mrs. Lawson immediately regarding a highly urgent administrative issue. Valerie narrowed her eyes in profound annoyance. Her perfectly powdered face twisted into a scowl. She clearly hated that a hired service worker was interrupting her grand moment of triumph. She waved her manicured hand dismissively through the air. She told him in a highly irritated and condescending tone to go find the event planner and to stop bothering her in front of her important guests. The manager did not move a single inch backward. He stood his ground and raised his voice even louder, ensuring that every millionaire in the room could hear his exact words. He stated that the event planner could not help resolve this situation because the issue was directly related to the primary payment method. He informed Valerie that the premium credit card she had placed on file that morning had just been flagged and completely declined by the issuing bank. He announced the outstanding balance was exactly $10,000 for the luxury food and staffing services provided thus far. He demanded immediate payment in full, or he would be forced to order his staff to pack up the remaining food and leave the premises immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of affluent guests. In their exclusive social circles, having a credit card declined at your own luxury event was the ultimate unforgivable humiliation. It was a brutal public indicator of financial instability and social fraud. People began to exchange wide-eyed, horrified glances. A few guests took small steps backward, physically distancing themselves from Valerie as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. Valerie turned a bright, angry shade of crimson. Her carefully constructed mask of superiority cracked under the intense pressure of 70 judgmental stares. She let out a forced, high-pitched laugh, attempting to play the disastrous situation off as a simple banking error to her wealthy friends. She loudly declared that her primary bank was notoriously overprotective and frequently froze her accounts when she made unusually large luxury purchases. She tried her absolute best to sound casual and annoyed by the burdens of her own immense wealth. She marched down the final step and grabbed her designer leather purse from a nearby entryway table. She aggressively dug through the expensive bag and pulled out a heavy metal platinum backup card. She held it up high in the air so the crowd could clearly see the prestigious banking logo stamped on the metal. She thrust the heavy card directly into the catering manager's chest. She ordered him to run the secondary card immediately and then get out of her sight forever for trying to ruin her perfect party. The manager remained completely stoic. He held up the sleek black mobile payment terminal for everyone to see. He inserted the heavy platinum card into the electronic reader slot. The bright digital screen illuminated the tense faces of the people standing nearby. The entire room held its collective breath. The silence was so incredibly heavy, it felt like it could crush the very foundation of the house. I watched the small digital loading circle spin endlessly on the terminal screen. I knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes in the vast digital banking networks. 30 minutes ago, my legal team had executed the total asset freeze on Cameron's fraudulent startup company. Because Valerie had illegally tied her personal finances and Ian's stolen business funds directly to her brother's sinking digital empire, the federal automated fraud algorithms had instantly locked down her entire financial identity. Every single line of credit, every checking account, and every digital wallet attached to her name had been frozen solid by federal banking regulators. She possessed absolutely zero purchasing power. The mobile payment terminal let out a loud, harsh, piercing red beep. It was an ugly electronic sound that echoed brutally in the quiet room. The small screen flashed a bright crimson warning light that reflected off Valerie's expensive jewelry. The catering manager pulled the metal card out of the slot and looked directly at the glaring red text on the screen. He did not whisper the final result. He read the screen aloud with brutal clarity. He announced that the secondary platinum card had also been completely declined. He read the specific error code stating the bank had issued a hard block and requested the merchant confiscate the card immediately due to suspected fraudulent activity. Valerie stared at the small black machine as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified under her expensive makeup. Her hands began to shake visibly. Her mouth opened, but she could not form a single coherent word to defend herself. The smug, arrogant woman who had just humiliated me in front of the entire town was suddenly gone. In her place stood a deeply panicked criminal who was just beginning to realize that her stolen financial fortress was rapidly collapsing directly on top of her head. Panic flickered intensely across her perfectly powdered face as she looked frantically around the room for anyone to help her. The heavy oak front doors of the estate suddenly burst open with extreme violent force. The loud crash of the heavy solid wood slamming against the expensive drywall shattered the paralyzed silence of the formal living room. Cameron Lawson stumbled across the pristine marble threshold. He was completely out of breath. He was sweating profusely. His usually immaculate custom-tailored suit was entirely disheveled. The expensive silk tie he always wore like a badge of arrogant honor was torn open at his throat. His expensive leather shoes squeaked loudly against the polished floor as he desperately tried to catch his balance. He looked absolutely nothing like the confident tech visionary he pretended to be on television. He looked like a hunted animal running completely out of places to hide. His eyes darted wildly around the crowded room, scanning the sea of shocked millionaires until they locked directly onto his sister. He did not care about the 70 wealthy guests watching him. He did not care about social etiquette or ruining her perfect housewarming party. He was a man watching his entire fraudulent life burn to the ground. Cameron sprinted across the formal entryway, ignoring the staring crowd entirely. He grabbed Valerie roughly by her bare shoulder, pulling her forcefully away from the marble kitchen island. His grip was so tight her skin turned instantly pale white beneath his trembling fingers. He dragged her aggressively into the long, dimly lit corridor that led toward the private home office. Valerie tried to resist his pull, letting out a sharp gasp of indignation, but the sheer, desperate strength of her terrified brother overwhelmed her completely. I did not stay in the main living room. I moved with slow, deliberate, silent steps, following just a few feet behind them. I positioned myself perfectly in the deep shadows of the hallway, standing right next to a towering indoor plant. I raised my glass of sparkling water to my lips, taking a slow, measured sip. I was standing exactly 3 feet away from them. I was close enough to hear their ragged breathing. I was close enough to smell the acrid scent of pure, unfiltered terror radiating off Cameron. Neither of them even noticed I was standing there. They were too consumed by the rapidly approaching flames of their own absolute destruction. Cameron pressed Valerie hard against the expensive, textured wallpaper. He leaned his face inches from hers, speaking in a rapid, frantic, desperate whisper that echoed loudly in the narrow corridor. He told her everything was completely gone. He explained that a fleet of unmarked black vehicles had just surrounded his downtown corporate headquarters less than an hour ago. Dozens of hostile corporate auditors, accompanied by heavily armed private security contractors, had stormed the building without warning. They did not knock. They did not ask for permission. They completely bypassed his building security systems using federal injunction codes. Cameron described how men in dark suits had literally ripped his primary data servers straight out of the server room walls. They had legally seized every single digital asset, every hardware component, and every line of code his company supposedly owned. He told his sister he had tried to access the offshore accounts where they had hidden Ian's stolen money, but the digital portals were completely wiped clean. The passwords did not work. The routing numbers were dead. The hostile investors had entirely swallowed his company whole. Valerie stared at her brother with an expression of profound, empty horror. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The devastating reality of Cameron's frantic words was systematically dismantling every single pillar of her stolen suburban empire. She shook her head violently back and forth, physically rejecting the absolute truth. She grabbed the lapels of Cameron's ruined suit, demanding he stop lying to her immediately. She hissed that they had millions of dollars securely hidden in encrypted international holding accounts. She reminded him that she had personally transferred over $500,000 of her husband's money just to keep those exact servers running. Cameron looked at her with hollow, dead eyes. He told her the hostile takeover was not a standard corporate buyout. It was an aggressive, absolute liquidation. The invisible investors had somehow legally purchased his entire mountain of underground debt. They now owned him entirely. They owned the code, they owned the accounts, and they owned the stolen money. He was completely bankrupt and totally exposed to severe federal prosecution. I watched the entire scene unfold with the cold precision of a surgeon observing a successful procedure. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the carbonation dance on my tongue. I had engineered this exact moment over the course of 48 sleepless hours. I had utilized a complex labyrinth of blind trusts, aggressive shell corporations, and ruthless legal maneuvering to build the exact cage Cameron and Valerie were currently bleeding out inside. Cameron was weeping now. Actual tears of pure selfish terror streamed down his face, ruining his expensive cologne. He whispered that the violent underground lenders he originally borrowed money from were going to hunt him down. He did not realize that I was now the sole legal owner of that massive illicit debt. I was the monster in the dark he was so terrified of. I owned his future, I owned his freedom, and I owned his consequences. Valerie refused to accept her absolute defeat. Her manicured hands trembled violently as she dug into her designer leather purse to retrieve her expensive smartphone. She loudly declared that Cameron was simply panicking over a standard banking glitch. She insisted her elite private wealth manager at the premier international bank would fix this minor inconvenience instantly. She was acting entirely on pure, desperate delusion. She dialed the exclusive unlisted phone number for her private banking concierge. She was so consumed by her own arrogant superiority that she pressed the speakerphone button, wanting Cameron to hear the banker confirm her immense wealth. She held the glowing screen up between them. I stood completely still in the dark hallway, listening to the dial tone ring through the crisp speaker. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. Valerie tapped her expensive high heel against the hardwood floor, her breathing ragged and shallow. She expected a polite professional assistant to answer and grovel for her approval. She expected her stolen money to protect her from the consequences of her actions, just like it always had. The ringing stopped abruptly. A harsh mechanical click sounded through the speakerphone. It was not the warm, welcoming voice of her dedicated private wealth manager. It was a cold, perfectly modulated, automated female voice. The robotic voice projected clearly into the narrow hallway, delivering a message of absolute financial execution. The automated system stated clearly that the requested banking profile had been permanently suspended. Valerie let out a sharp, terrified gasp, trying to press buttons on the screen to bypass the message. The relentless mechanical voice continued speaking over her frantic tapping. It informed her that all associated routing numbers, checking accounts, investment portfolios, and international wire capabilities linked to her Social Security number were under an immediate strict federal lockdown. The voice then delivered the final fatal blow. It stated the accounts were completely inaccessible, pending a massive ongoing investigation into severe wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The line went completely dead. A loud, hollow dial tone echoed through the corridor. Valerie stared blankly at the dark screen of her expensive phone. The dial tone continued to buzz loudly in her hand, sounding like a flatline on a hospital heart monitor. Her entire fraudulent empire had evaporated in less than 3 minutes. The money she had systematically stolen from my hard-working son was gone. The fake cryptocurrency business she had funneled it into was legally liquidated. Her premium credit lines were permanently severed by federal regulators. She was standing in a massive luxury estate she could no longer afford, holding a phone connected to a bank account that no longer existed. Cameron slid slowly down the expensive wallpaper, collapsing onto the hardwood floor, holding his head in his shaking hands. Valerie simply stood there, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own destruction. I swallowed the last drop of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the glass. I turned away from the pathetic display of ruined criminals and walked slowly back toward the bright lights of the main living room. The heavy artillery had done its job perfectly. Now it was time for the infantry to arrive and sweep the battlefield clean. Valerie abandoned her weeping brother in the dark corridor and stepped back into the bright warmth of the formal living room. I watched her from my quiet spot near the indoor foliage. She was a master of deception. In the span of 3 seconds, she wiped the sheer terror completely off her face, smoothed the invisible wrinkles from her expensive silk dress, and pasted on a radiant, flawless smile. She walked back into the center of the party, as if her entire financial world had not just been vaporized into digital dust. The atmosphere in the room was still incredibly tense from the catering manager's public demand for payment. The wealthy guests were huddled in small, uncomfortable groups, whispering behind their hands and casting suspicious glances in her direction. Valerie knew she was losing control of her audience. She needed to immediately reclaim her dominant position before the whispers turned into absolute social exile. She glided toward the massive marble kitchen island and picked up a fresh glass of champagne. She did not tap the glass this time. Instead, she let out a loud, melodious laugh that forced the murmuring crowd to stop and look at her. She elegantly waved her hand through the air, dismissing the terrifying banking failure as a simple, amusing anecdote about the burdens of extreme wealth. She loudly declared that elite international banks were simply too overzealous with their fraud protection algorithms whenever she transferred large sums for her philanthropic endeavors. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, but she delivered it with such aggressive confidence that a few of the more gullible socialites actually nodded in sympathetic agreement. Having temporarily bandaged her bleeding social status, Valerie immediately pivoted to the only tangible asset she believed she still controlled. She began to boast about the house. She spread her arms wide, gesturing to the soaring vaulted ceilings and the imported crystal chandeliers. She raised her voice so it echoed perfectly off the smooth, custom-painted walls. She told the captive audience that she had personally designed every single inch of this magnificent smart home. She bragged about the rare Italian marble imported specifically for the kitchen countertops and the heated flooring installed throughout the entire massive estate. She walked over to a sleek, glowing digital panel mounted on the wall and demonstrated how she could control the ambient lighting, the climate, and the security locks with a single touch of her manicured finger. She was using the physical structure of the house as a protective shield against the creeping reality of her total bankruptcy. Her voice grew louder and more arrogant with every word. She emphasized her sole ownership of the property, deliberately excluding Ian from the narrative entirely. She claimed she had spent months ruthlessly negotiating with the most exclusive real estate developers in the state to secure this exact premium parcel of land. She painted herself as a brilliant, uncompromising negotiator who had single-handedly conquered the suburban real estate market. She looked out over the crowd of millionaires, her chin tilted upward, desperately trying to force them to admire her. She needed them to see her as a self-made queen standing inside her impenetrable fortress. She had absolutely no idea that the fortress was built on rented dirt, and the true king was quietly drinking sparkling water just 20 feet away. As Valerie continued her desperate boasting monologue about property values and exclusive neighborhood zoning laws, the heavy oak front doors swung open once again. The cool night air rushed into the warm foyer, carrying with it a man of undeniable presence and immense local authority. It was Gordon Davis, the primary real estate developer and chief architectural director for the entire luxury subdivision. He was a towering silver-haired man wearing a bespoke navy suit, carrying a thick roll of architectural blueprints securely under his right arm. Gordon was a local legend among the affluent crowd. He was the visionary builder responsible for transforming empty fields into multi-million-dollar gated communities. The wealthy guests immediately recognized him. A murmur of genuine respect rippled through the room as the crowd naturally parted to let him through. Valerie stopped her speech mid-sentence. Her eyes lit up with a massive surge of renewed arrogance. She believed Gordon Davis had personally come to her housewarming party to congratulate her on finishing the construction of his flagship property. This was the ultimate social validation she desperately needed to erase the lingering doubts caused by the catering disaster. She quickly handed her champagne flute to a passing waiter and smoothed her hair. She stepped away from the kitchen island and glided gracefully across the hardwood floor, directly toward the entryway. She extended both of her arms, preparing to greet the famous developer with a theatrical, double-cheeked kiss in front of her entire audience. She called out his name in a sickeningly sweet, familiar tone, welcoming him to what she loudly proclaimed was her absolute masterpiece. Gordon Davis did not slow his pace. He did not extend his arms to meet hers. He did not even look at her face. He walked past Valerie with such a smooth, uninterrupted stride that he barely avoided stepping on the hem of her expensive silk dress. He treated her exactly like a piece of invisible, irrelevant furniture, blocking his path. Valerie froze with her arms still awkwardly outstretched in the empty air. Her welcoming smile shattered completely. She stumbled backward a half step, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson as she realized she had just been profoundly and publicly ignored by the most important man in the room. Gordon continued walking with intense purpose straight through the center of the crowd. He was not looking for a drink. He was not looking to socialize. He was looking directly at me. I remained perfectly still near the foliage, watching my chief operating officer approach. Gordon stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He did not offer a casual greeting. He snapped his feet together, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, unmistakable deference, and extended his right hand. I transferred my water glass to my left hand and met his firm grip. When Gordon spoke, he did not whisper. He projected his deep, booming voice clearly across the dead-silent living room, ensuring every single affluent guest heard exactly who he was addressing. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," he said, his tone dripping with absolute professional reverence. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, sir. I just received the final zoning approvals from the City Council. The remaining 400 acres of the western expansion have been fully permitted under your primary holding company. As the supreme chairman of the development firm, your signature is required to authorize the groundbreaking tomorrow morning." He unrolled the thick architectural blueprints and held them out toward me with both hands, presenting them like a vital military report to a commanding general. The entire room stopped breathing. The 70 wealthy guests who had just spent the last 10 minutes listening to Valerie boast about her supreme negotiating skills and her brilliant property ownership were now staring at the old lawnmower in the charcoal suit. The man they had pitied was currently receiving a multi-million-dollar operational briefing from the most powerful developer in the county. The cognitive dissonance was so intense you could practically hear their minds breaking. I slowly took the blueprints from Gordon, offering him a single approving nod. "Excellent work, Gordon," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying the quiet, effortless weight of genuine authority. "I will review the parcel boundaries and sign off before midnight. The soil composition on that western ridge requires careful management. We do not build our foundations on unstable dirt." I looked over the top of the blueprints directly at Valerie. She was standing exactly where Gordon had left her, stranded in the middle of the open floor. Her jaw was literally hanging open. Her eyes were completely wide and frantic, darting back and forth between Gordon Davis and the man she had just publicly mocked. She looked at my weathered hands, the blueprints I was holding, and the deferential posture of the famous developer standing before me. The horrific realization was crashing down upon her in real time. The magnificent house she had been bragging about. The exclusive neighborhood she thought she had conquered. The very ground she was standing on. It was all entirely conceptualized, funded, and ultimately controlled by the man she had tried to banish to the service entrance. She was a tenant living in a fragile glass house, and she had just handed a sledgehammer directly to the landlord. Gordon Davis turned his broad shoulders toward the crowd of 70 wealthy guests. He did not ask for their attention because his sheer physical presence commanded it instantly. He looked at the affluent socialites, the corporate executives, and the local politicians who had spent the last 2 hours drinking expensive champagne and listening to Valerie boast. Gordon cleared his throat, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He projected his voice with the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to leading massive boardrooms. He announced clearly and unapologetically that it was his absolute honor to formally introduce the true visionary behind this entire luxury subdivision. He stated that Howard Bennett was not just a guest at this housewarming party. He announced that I was the supreme founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole owner of the primary construction conglomerate that had developed every single square inch of this elite neighborhood. The collective gasp that left the lungs of the wealthy attendees was practically loud enough to shatter the imported crystal chandeliers hanging above our heads. The women in their expensive silk dresses and the men in their custom-tailored suits stared at me with their mouths slightly open. The man they had collectively pitied just 10 minutes ago, the man they thought was a lowly lawn maintenance worker, accidentally invited to a high-society gathering, was in fact the undisputed master of their entire suburban reality. They realized with profound embarrassment that I was vastly wealthier and infinitely more powerful than every single person in that room combined. I watched their arrogant expressions melt into pure, unadulterated shock and profound respect. They immediately took synchronized steps backward, creating a wide physical circle of deference around me and Gordon Davis. Valerie looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had just been dropped onto solid concrete. Her perfectly powdered face twitched uncontrollably. Her eyes were completely wide and frantic, darting wildly between my weathered hands and Gordon Davis's expensive navy suit. Her brain was violently rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of her. She stammered, her voice a high-pitched, raspy whisper completely stripped of its previous arrogant venom. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and tried to tell the crowd that Gordon was lying. She desperately claimed that she had personally negotiated the purchase of this property and that she owned the house free and clear. She insisted that an old dirt-covered landscaper could not possibly be the owner of a multi-million-dollar real estate firm. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The crowd parted even further, giving me absolute command of the vast open floor. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. My voice was completely calm, steady, and devoid of any emotional vulnerability. I explained to her the fundamental difference between building a fragile glass house and owning the solid earth it rests upon. I told her that she was suffering from a massive, catastrophic misunderstanding of commercial real estate law. I revealed that my anonymous holding company had purchased this entire tract of land over a decade ago, long before she ever sank her venomous claws into my son. I explained that she had never actually purchased the dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring every millionaire in the room absorbed every single syllable of her absolute financial humiliation. I told Valerie that the contract she had so proudly signed, the one she thought proved her supreme negotiating skills, was nothing more than a highly restrictive land lease. She and Ian owned the physical drywall, the imported Italian marble countertops, the glass windows, and the heated floors, but they did not own the foundation. I owned the ground. I owned the soil. I owned the dirt. I was the actual legal leaseholder of the very earth anchoring her stolen suburban palace. She was nothing more than a temporary glorified tenant occupying a structure built on my private property. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved dramatically as she struggled to pull oxygen into her tightening lungs. She tried to argue that a land lease still gave her the absolute right to live in the house forever. She aggressively claimed that I could not touch her because she had poured her own money into the physical construction of the estate. That was the exact moment I chose to spring the second lethal mechanism of our meticulously engineered legal trap. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer weight of my words crushed her remaining defiance into absolute dust. I informed her that I was fully aware of exactly where her construction money had come from. I announced to the silent room that she had built her spectacular smart home using hundreds of thousands of dollars systematically embezzled from my son's joint business accounts. I told her the funds she used were illegally obtained through corporate fraud, wire theft, and severe marital embezzlement to prop up her brother Cameron's failing cryptocurrency venture. I watched the blood drain entirely from her neck and face. The wealthy guests surrounding us began whispering frantically to each other, deeply horrified by the casual mention of federal wire fraud occurring right in their midst. I explained the final fatal clause hidden deep within the impenetrable legal language of her master land lease. I told Valerie that my corporate attorneys had embedded a very specific strict morality and criminal activity clause into the original land grant. Because she had utilized stolen illicit funds to construct the physical property resting on my soil, she had committed a catastrophic breach of contract. That specific breach granted me the absolute unilateral legal right to revoke the land lease instantly. I held the supreme unyielding authority to cancel her residency and force the immediate forfeiture of the entire physical structure. I was legally permitted to sweep her out of the house and seize the property to cover the damages she had inflicted upon my son. The terrifying realization of her total absolute ruin finally crashed through her thick wall of sociopathic delusion. She was completely bankrupt. Her fraudulent credit cards were totally frozen. Her brother's company was legally liquidated. And now the magnificent multi-million-dollar house she had stolen was being ripped straight out from under her manicured feet by the very man she had publicly humiliated. She had absolutely no money, no leverage, and no escape route. She was completely trapped inside a burning building of her own arrogant design. Suddenly, a violent spark of desperate manic hope ignited deep behind her panicked eyes. Her brain, scrambling for any possible lifeline, completely bypassed logic and latched onto a single fragile memory. She remembered the heavy wooden clipboard she had shoved into Ian's chest just an hour ago. She remembered the rapid quitclaim deed she had forced him to sign in the middle of the party. In her frantic, terrified mind, she truly believed that the legal document she had coerced out of her husband would somehow grant her complete absolute immunity. She believed that with Ian's signature legally surrendering all his equity directly to her, she could magically override my land lease and block the impending eviction. It was the desperate delusion of a cornered predator grasping at thin air. Valerie let out a sudden guttural, piercing shriek. It was not a delicate cry of distress. It was a visceral, terrifying sound of pure, primal panic that echoed violently against the high vaulted ceilings. The sheer intensity of the scream caused several wealthy guests to physically jump backward in alarm. She spun around so violently that the hem of her expensive silk designer dress caught on the heel of her shoe, almost sending her crashing to the hardwood floor. She caught her balance and began sprinting with reckless, manic speed across the vast living room. She shoved her way aggressively through the crowd of stunned millionaires, knocking shoulders and elbows, pushing her own elite affluent friends out of her path with violent desperation. She threw herself toward the grand mahogany staircase where the massive mountain of wrapped housewarming gifts was meticulously stacked. She crashed into the pile with zero regard for the expensive items. Silver wrapping paper tore loudly. Thick silk ribbons snapped. Heavy crystal boxes tumbled down the stairs and shattered against the polished marble floor. She was digging frantically with both of her shaking hands, tearing through the luxury gifts like a starving animal, desperately searching for the wooden clipboard she had carelessly tossed aside. I stood perfectly still next to Gordon Davis and my son Ian, watching her manic, disgraceful excavation. We knew she was searching for a magical shield that no longer existed. The chemical ghost ink had already completed its silent, flawless evaporation process, but we were more than willing to let her dig through the ruins of her stolen life just a little bit longer. Valerie clawed through the shattered remnants of her luxury housewarming gifts with reckless ferocity. Shreds of imported silver wrapping paper and crushed silk ribbons clung to her expensive designer dress. She tossed a broken crystal decanter aside and plunged her trembling hands deep into the bottom of the ruined pile. Her manicured fingers finally scraped against the smooth surface of the heavy wooden clipboard she had hidden there an hour ago. She ripped it out from under a crushed cardboard box and spun around to face the silent crowd. Her chest heaved violently as she held the wooden board up like a holy shield. She loudly demanded that everyone look at the official legal document proving she possessed absolute uncontested ownership of the entire physical structure. She confidently flipped back the thick metal clasp and presented the pristine white page to the room. Her triumphant smirk dissolved instantly into an expression of raw, unadulterated terror. The bottom signature line was completely blank. The specialized chemical compound inside the silver fountain pen had performed its molecular evaporation flawlessly. There was absolutely zero trace of blue ink remaining anywhere on the crisp parchment. No indentation marked the surface. No chemical residue stained the fibers. The rapid quitclaim deed was completely useless. Valerie stared at this empty signature line with bulging, terrified eyes. She rubbed her thumb aggressively over the smooth white paper, desperately trying to make the vanished ink magically reappear. Ian stepped away from my side and walked slowly across the imported hardwood floor. He moved with the predatory grace of an apex predator circling a deeply wounded animal. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of his trembling wife. He reached out and effortlessly pulled the wooden clipboard from her paralyzed hands. He turned his body toward the 70 wealthy guests and held the blank document high above his head for everyone to inspect. He projected his voice with absolute calm authority. He informed the silent crowd that his wife had just attempted to execute a fraudulent real estate transfer right in the middle of their celebration. He explained that she had tried to legally strip him of his entire home equity while serving them expensive imported champagne. A loud wave of genuine disgust rippled through the affluent socialites. Her closest friends visibly physically recoiled from her as the sheer sociopathic nature of her betrayal became public knowledge. Ian lowered the clipboard and handed it to a nearby catering waiter. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored navy suit. He pulled out a sleek digital tablet and swiped the screen awake. He announced to the captive audience that Valerie had been running a highly sophisticated financial extraction operation against his private corporate accounts for 18 consecutive months. He read the precise transaction dates and exact monetary figures aloud, ensuring every millionaire in the room understood the staggering magnitude of her theft. He detailed how she had systematically siphoned over $500,000 out of his emergency business reserves. He explained her deliberate methodology of keeping every unauthorized wire transfer just below the mandatory federal reporting limits to avoid triggering any internal banking audits. He exposed her fake consulting invoices and fabricated supply chain receipts to the horrified guests. He methodically stripped away her carefully manufactured image of a brilliant independent businesswoman. He revealed her as nothing more than a common domestic embezzler who had weaponized her marriage certificate to rob her own husband blind. Valerie clamped her hands over her ears, attempting to block out the devastating public exposure of her criminal enterprise. Ian tapped the screen of his digital tablet and brought up a highly complex banking schematic. He walked directly over to the massive smart home television screen mounted above the marble fireplace. He wirelessly mirrored his tablet display onto the massive glowing monitor. The enormous high-definition screen illuminated the entire living room with undeniable digital proof. The bright chart explicitly mapped the exact routing trajectory of every single stolen dollar. The guests stared at the massive glowing arrows pointing directly from Ian's corporate bank accounts to a series of hidden offshore shell corporations. Ian traced the final digital destination with his finger. He announced that every single embezzled penny had ultimately landed in the operational accounts of Cameron Lawson's fraudulent cryptocurrency startup. He did not stop there. He pulled up the digitized copy of the freshly approved secondary mortgage application. He displayed the flawless forgery of his own signature magnified 10 times its normal size on the massive television screen. He informed the crowd that Valerie had legally committed a major federal felony by leveraging his property to secure another massive illicit cash injection for her brother. Cameron stood frozen near the grand mahogany staircase, watching the massive television screen broadcast his complete financial ruin to the entire city elite. The undeniable digital evidence connecting his fake technology company to severe marital embezzlement and federal wire fraud was completely overwhelming. He realized instantly that the hostile investment firm taking over his company was only the beginning of his absolute destruction. He understood that federal prison was now an unavoidable mathematical certainty. A deep, primal instinct for basic survival completely overrode his cognitive reasoning. He turned his back on his weeping sister and bolted toward the rear of the sprawling estate. He sprinted frantically toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass patio doors, hoping to escape into the dark, expansive backyard. His expensive leather shoes slipped wildly on the polished marble floors as he desperately scrambled for traction. He reached out to grab the heavy brass handle of the sliding glass door. The dense crowd of wealthy guests scrambled out of his reckless path to avoid the frantic, fleeing criminal. Cameron slammed his entire body weight against the heavy glass door, pushing it forcefully along its metal track. The cool night air rushed into the heated living room as the door slid open. He took exactly one desperate step over the metal threshold onto the expensive imported stone pavers of the back patio. He truly believed he had successfully breached the containment perimeter. He thought he could sprint across the manicured lawn, climb the tall privacy fence, and disappear completely into the dark suburban wilderness. He was operating under the pathetic delusion that a man wearing a custom-tailored suit could outrun a meticulously engineered corporate security operation. Two massive figures materialized instantly from the deep shadows of the covered outdoor entertaining area. They were highly trained private security contractors I had personally deployed around the entire perimeter of the estate hours before the party even began. They wore completely unmarked tactical black clothing and moved with terrifying synchronized precision. The first contractor stepped laterally across the stone patio, completely blocking the narrow escape route leading toward the back gates. The second contractor lunged forward and planted his heavy combat boot directly onto the sliding track of the glass door. Cameron slammed violently into an impenetrable wall of solid human muscle. The physical impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. He bounced off the massive security guard and stumbled backward into the bright light of the living room. The first security contractor grabbed Cameron by the lapels of his expensive silk suit jacket. He lifted the frantic, cowardly man entirely off the ground. He dragged him effortlessly back across the threshold and deposited him roughly onto the imported hardwood floor right in front of the massive glowing television screen broadcasting his crimes. The second contractor stepped inside the house and calmly pulled the heavy glass patio door firmly shut, locking the brass mechanism with a loud, definitive click. The two imposing guards stood side by side with their arms crossed over their broad chests, forming an absolute physical barricade against the glass. They did not say a single word. They did not draw any weapons. Their sheer, intimidating physical presence was entirely sufficient to crush any remaining thoughts of escape. Cameron scrambled backward across the smooth floor like a terrified crab until his back hit the solid base of the marble kitchen island. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest and buried his sweating face in his trembling hands. The entire room watched in absolute stunned silence as the two arrogant sibling predators realized they were completely sealed inside an inescapable, transparent cage of their own making. The crowd of 70 millionaires stood frozen in place while their collective breath remained held tight within their lungs. The ambient temperature in the sprawling living room seemed to plummet dramatically. From the dense cluster of shocked guests standing near the grand piano, a single figure detached himself with surgical precision. This was Owen Gallagher. He was my chief corporate counsel, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of high-stakes litigation with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a mechanical predator. He wore a midnight blue suit cut so sharply it looked like tailored armor. He did not rush his movements. He did not betray a single ounce of adrenaline or hesitation. His leather wingtip shoes clicked with a steady, rhythmic, metronomic finality against the imported hardwood floor. The wealthy socialites instinctively pulled their shoulders back to give him a wide berth. They recognized a legal executioner when they saw one. Owen walked directly past the shattered remains of the crystal gifts and the ruined velvet boxes scattered at the bottom of the grand staircase. He did not even glance at Cameron, who was still cowering pathetically against the base of the marble kitchen island under the watchful eyes of my private security contractors. Owen had only one specific target tonight. He marched straight toward Valerie carrying a massive, incredibly thick stack of pristine legal documents bound tightly together by a thick industrial rubber band. Valerie watched his methodical approach with wide, unblinking eyes. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, erratic spasms. She instinctively crossed her bare arms tightly over her chest in a desperate, subconscious attempt to shield herself from the impending assault. Owen stopped exactly one arm length away from her. He did not offer a polite introduction. He did not lower his voice to grant her the dignity of a private conversation. He raised the heavy brick of paperwork and thrust it forward, holding it suspended in the empty space between them. Valerie refused to extend her hands. She shook her head in short, frantic, jerky motions, retreating backward until her spine collided harshly with the wooden banister of the staircase. Owen did not withdraw the papers. He simply reached out with his left hand, grabbed her wrist with an iron, uncompromising grip, and physically pressed the massive stack of legal destruction directly into her trembling palms. He released her wrist and stepped back, letting the sheer physical weight of the documents force her arms to drop slightly. The thick rubber band groaned under the pressure of hundreds of densely printed pages. Owen squared his shoulders and addressed the room at large, ensuring that his booming baritone voice penetrated the deepest corners of the massive estate. He officially announced that he was serving Valerie with an immediate expedited petition for the absolute dissolution of her marriage to Ian. He detailed the specific parameters of the filing with brutal surgical clarity. He explained that Ian was filing for an at-fault divorce, citing severe financial infidelity, gross marital embezzlement, and egregious criminal fraud. Owen loudly proclaimed that every single joint asset, every shared bank account, and every mutual line of credit had already been unilaterally frozen by federal decree. He stated clearly that any prenuptial agreements or standard community property laws were now completely null and void due to her extensive documented theft. Ian stood silently near the entryway, his posture completely rigid, his face carved from solid granite. He did not look at his wife. He did not offer a single ounce of lingering affection or hesitation. He watched the legal severing of his marriage with the cold, detached observation of a man watching a diseased limb being successfully amputated. Valerie stared at Ian, her mouth opening and closing in a silent, pathetic plea for mercy. But she found absolutely nothing but an impenetrable wall of ice. Owen was far from finished. He raised his hand, commanding the silent room to listen as he unleashed the heaviest artillery in his legal arsenal. He instructed Valerie to look at the second half of the massive paper stack resting in her shaking hands. He informed her that those specific pages constituted a direct formal federal fraud summons issued by the United States Department of Justice. He articulated the exact criminal statutes she had flagrantly violated. He loudly explained to the captive audience of affluent guests that forging a spouse signature on a secondary mortgage application to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden equity was not a simple domestic dispute. It was a massive federal crime. Owen detailed how leveraging a property across state banking lines using fabricated digital identities triggered immediate charges of severe wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He stated that the penalty for these specific overlapping felonies carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He deliberately used the word penitentiary, letting the harsh, terrifying reality of maximum security prison echo violently against the expensive vaulted ceilings of the luxury home she had tried to steal. The sheer insurmountable weight of the overlapping legal catastrophes finally crushed the last remaining pillar of Valerie's psychological endurance. Her meticulously maintained facade of arrogant superiority completely imploded. Her manicured fingers went entirely numb. She lost all motor control in her hands and wrists. The massive stack of legal documents slipped directly through her grasp. The heavy brick of paper plummeted toward the floor. The thick industrial rubber band snapped loudly, echoing like a gunshot in the dead silent room. Hundreds of crisp white pages exploded outward upon impact. The divorce petitions, the federal subpoenas, the banking logs, and the criminal summons scattered wildly across the polished marble floor. The white pages spread out around her expensive designer shoes like a blanket of fresh snow. She stared down at the ruined, chaotic mess of legal destruction resting at her feet. She did not bend down to pick up a single page. She simply stood there, swaying slightly on her high heels, her entire physical body shutting down under the colossal pressure of her absolute, undeniable ruin. The sprawling estate remained paralyzed in a state of profound, uncomfortable quiet. 70 millionaires held their collective breath watching the total obliteration of a woman who had dared to play a high-stakes game of financial treason and lost absolutely everything. Valerie's lips trembled violently. She tried to suck in a deep breath to form a defense, to scream an excuse, to deploy one of her manipulative lies. Her vocal cords completely failed her. Her brain was hopelessly short-circuiting, utterly incapable of processing the speed and severity of her downfall. She let out a soft, pathetic, broken whimpering sound that resembled a dying animal. Across the room, Cameron remained curled into a tight ball against the base of the kitchen island. He pressed his sweating forehead against his knees, rocking back and forth in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. Neither the arrogant sister who thought she could steal an empire, nor the fraudulent brother who thought he could outsmart the financial world could form a single coherent sentence. They were completely stripped of their weapons, their words, and their stolen wealth. They were drowning in a silent ocean of their own making, and no one in that room was going to throw them a lifeline. Cameron peeled himself off the polished hardwood floor. His expensive silk suit was completely ruined and soaked with cold sweat. He leaned heavily against the cold marble of the kitchen island, trying to force his trembling legs to support his weight. He looked at his sister standing paralyzed amidst a sea of scattered legal documents. He looked at Ian standing like a stone statue. Then he looked at the crowd of wealthy socialites who were staring at him with undisguised contempt. A sudden, desperate surge of pure, arrogant delusion washed over his panicked brain. He falsely believed he could still bluff his way out of a steel trap. He pushed himself upright and puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of an untouchable technology visionary. He cleared his throat loudly, attempting to break the suffocating silence of the massive living room. He announced to the entire room that this was nothing more than a pathetic local dispute over petty cash. He claimed that Ian and Owen Gallagher were simply trying to intimidate them with meaningless paperwork. He aggressively stated that his revolutionary digital company was backed by a consortium of incredibly powerful anonymous technology investors. He bragged that these invisible billionaires possessed bottomless financial resources and elite legal teams. He promised Valerie that these elite backers would immediately wire millions of dollars into their accounts to bail them out of this temporary inconvenience. He boasted that his investors would happily tie Ian and the corporate lawyers of the firm up in endless appellate courts for the next 20 years until they begged for a settlement. He was desperately throwing imaginary money at a very real concrete wall. I watched Cameron spin his pathetic web of absolute lies. I did not interrupt him. I let him build his imaginary fortress of arrogant tech wealth as high as he possibly could. I wanted every single millionaire in that room to hear the sheer magnitude of his toxic delusion before I completely obliterated it. When he finally stopped talking to catch his ragged breath, the room remained absolutely silent. No one believed a single word he said. I slowly walked away from Gordon Davis and moved deliberately across the open floor toward the kitchen island. My footsteps were slow and measured, echoing softly against the imported wood. I kept my posture completely relaxed and my face entirely blank. I did not project anger or malice. I projected the cold, unfeeling certainty of a creeping glacier. Cameron watched me approach. His desperate, arrogant facade began to crack instantly under my steady, unblinking gaze. He tried to stand taller, but his knees were physically shaking. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him, invading his personal space just enough to make him feel the suffocating weight of my presence. I looked at his ruined designer tie and his sweating forehead. I reached my right hand slowly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. Cameron flinched slightly, anticipating a physical blow. He truly thought I was going to strike him for the disrespect his sister had shown me earlier that evening. But I am a man of business, not a street brawler. I do not use my fists to destroy my enemies. I use paper and ink. I pulled my hand out of my jacket pocket. I was holding a single, sleek, rectangular piece of heavy cardstock between my index finger and my thumb. It was a premium business card crafted from matte black metal rather than traditional paper. It was designed to feel heavy and substantial in the hand, conveying immediate, undeniable authority. I extended my arm slowly, presenting the black metal card directly to Cameron. He stared at it for a long second, completely paralyzed by confusion. He hesitated before slowly raising his trembling right hand. He pinched the edge of the cold metal card and pulled it away from my grasp. He lowered his eyes to read the embossed silver text gleaming under the bright ambient light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. The silence in the sprawling estate was so absolute that I could actually hear the sharp, ragged intake of his breath when his eyes processed the logo. The embossed silver image was the exact geometric crest of the highly aggressive, anonymous investment firm that had violently raided his downtown corporate headquarters exactly 2 hours ago. It was the absolute, undeniable symbol of the hostile entity that had ripped his servers from the walls, frozen his digital wallets, and completely liquidated his fraudulent cryptocurrency empire. I kept my voice incredibly low and smooth, ensuring that only Cameron and the few guests standing closest to the kitchen island could hear the precise mechanics of his total financial execution. I calmly informed him that his anonymous technology investors were not going to wire him a single penny to bail him out of this spectacular mess. I explained that those invisible billionaires he was just bragging about did not actually exist. I told him that I was the sole apex predator swimming in his digital ocean. I detailed how the corporate legal team of my company had utilized a highly complex web of anonymous shell corporations and offshore proxies to quietly infiltrate his financial structure. I explained that I had tracked every single illicit wire transfer his sister had sent him. I watched his face turn a sickly shade of pale gray as I calmly outlined how I had systematically purchased his entire mountain of outstanding underground debt. I told him I had paid a premium in pure cash to legally acquire his $500,000 gambling obligations from the violent syndicate he originally borrowed from. I explained that the transaction was executed perfectly legally through recognized international banking channels. The hostile firm that raided his office, the faceless entity that swallowed his company whole, and the aggressive creditor who now held the absolute legal right to seize his remaining freedom were all just different names for the exact same man. Cameron stared at the embossed silver logo on the black metal card. His eyes were completely glassy and utterly vacant. His brain was violently short-circuiting, unable to process the terrifying reality of his new existence. He was not waiting for an elite team of corporate lawyers to save him. He was not waiting for a massive cash injection from benevolent tech billionaires. He was staring directly at the architect of his absolute ruin. He slowly lifted his head and looked deeply into my weathered face. He looked at my thick, calloused hands and my simple, conservative tie. The horrific realization finally crashed through his thick skull with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. He realized that he owed $1 million in immediate, non-negotiable debt directly to me. He owed his entire future and his physical safety to the exact same man his sister had just publicly humiliated, mocked, and referred to as a dirty old lawnmower in front of 70 local millionaires. The sheer poetic magnitude of the catastrophic mistake shattered his central nervous system completely. All the remaining strength instantly vanished from his legs. He let out a soft, pathetic, whimpering sound as his knees buckled completely. He slid slowly down the smooth surface of the painted drywall behind him. His expensive leather shoes scraped uselessly against the polished floor. He collapsed into a miserable, crumpled heap at my feet, clutching the black metal business card tightly to his chest, like a sinking anchor. He could not form a single coherent sentence. He could not beg for mercy because he knew absolutely none would be given. He simply sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, slowly drowning in the cold, dark reality of his complete financial and personal destruction, while the entire room watched his pathetic demise in total, uninterrupted silence. Owen Gallagher stepped carefully around the weeping, crumpled form of Cameron Lawson. The brilliant corporate attorney did not waste a single glance on the ruined brother. His polished leather shoes found a clear patch of imported marble floor right next to the massive scatter of white legal documents that Valerie had dropped moments ago. The 70 affluent guests remaining in the grand living room were practically holding their collective breath. The air in the sprawling estate felt remarkably thin, completely drained of oxygen by the sheer gravitational pull of the absolute financial destruction unfolding before their eyes. Owen adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue suit and locked his piercing gaze entirely onto Valerie. She was still swaying slightly on her expensive designer heels, her chest heaving as she stared at her brother, sobbing against the kitchen island. Owen did not offer her a moment to recover her shattered composure. He possessed the unyielding precision of a seasoned legal executioner, and he was ready to deliver the final killing blow to her stolen suburban kingdom. He projected his deep baritone voice across the silent room, ensuring that every wealthy socialite and corporate executive heard the exact parameters of her immediate doom. He informed Valerie that the fraudulent secondary mortgage she had so arrogantly secured was not just a massive federal felony. It was a localized contractual suicide. He articulated the incredibly dense legal framework of the master land lease that she had blindly signed without ever consulting an independent attorney. Owen explained that the primary lease contained a highly sensitive, universally binding morality and critical default clause. This specific clause was engineered to automatically trigger the absolute second any unauthorized financial encumbrance was illegally attached to the physical structure. By forging her husband's signature to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden equity, Valerie had not merely broken federal banking laws, she had instantly and permanently voided the entire foundational agreement that allowed her to legally reside on the property. Owen paced slowly back and forth in front of the devastated woman, breaking down the complex real estate law into brutal, easily digestible facts. He stated clearly that because Howard Bennett legally owned the actual dirt resting beneath the foundation, and because Howard's corporation held the primary construction debt for the materials used to build the home, he possessed the supreme uncontested authority to bypass standard eviction protocols. There would be no 30-day grace period. There would be no lengthy civil court battles, no mediated settlements, and absolutely no drawn-out tenant rights hearings. The commission of a major federal financial felony on the physical premises entirely eradicated her residency rights. Owen announced with chilling finality that the eviction order was not a pending threat. It was an active, immediate, and fully authorized legal execution. I stepped forward, moving seamlessly to stand shoulder to shoulder with my chief corporate counsel. The time for legal explanations had concluded. It was time for the physical reality of her actions to take immediate effect. I looked directly into Valerie's wide, bloodshot eyes. The arrogant smirk that she had weaponized against me at the front door was completely extinct. In its place was the raw, unfiltered terror of a woman who had just realized she was entirely homeless. I kept my voice incredibly smooth, completely devoid of any raised volume or aggressive shouting. True power never needs to scream to be heard. I told Valerie that her residency at this estate was officially terminated, effective immediately. I ordered her to turn around and walk up the grand mahogany staircase that she had just been boasting about to her elite friends. I instructed her to go directly into the master bedroom and find exactly one piece of standard travel luggage. I was extremely specific with my parameters to ensure there was absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I told her she was legally permitted to pack a single suitcase with basic everyday clothing and essential personal toiletries. She was strictly forbidden from taking any jewelry purchased with my son's money, any designer accessories funded by marital embezzlement, or any expensive electronics. Everything remaining in the house was now legally classified as frozen assets pending the massive federal fraud investigation and the impending divorce proceedings. I gave her precisely 10 minutes to pack her single bag and walk back down the stairs. If she took 1 minute longer, I assured her that my private security contractors would physically escort her out the front doors wearing absolutely nothing but the silk dress currently on her back. The sheer uncompromising brutality of my ultimatum finally snapped Valerie out of her paralyzed state of shock. The human brain can only absorb so much catastrophic trauma before it reverts to desperate primal manipulation. She realized she had absolutely no leverage left against me or my attorneys. I was an impenetrable fortress of legal and financial ruin. She could not intimidate me, and she certainly could not buy her way out of the trap. So she turned her frantic, weeping eyes toward the only person in the room she believed she could still control. She spun around to face Ian. My son was standing a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching his wife's total destruction with the cold, detached observation of a complete stranger. Valerie lunged toward him, closing the physical distance between them. She did not dare touch him, stopped abruptly by the absolute freezing aura radiating from his rigid posture. She completely broke down, unleashing a torrent of hysterical, dramatic sobs that echoed loudly across the vaulted ceilings. She begged him to intervene. She pleaded with him to stop his father and his ruthless lawyers from throwing her out into the cold night like common trash. She deployed every single emotional weapon she had successfully used to manipulate him over the past 3 years. She reminded him of their sacred wedding vows. She cried about their shared history, desperately claiming that she only took the money because she was terrified for her brother's life and did not want to burden her husband with the stress. She screamed at Ian to be a real man, demanding that he step up and defend his own wife against his cruel, vindictive father. She performed the role of the helpless, victimized spouse with absolute theatrical perfection, desperately hoping the wealthy guests watching the scene would somehow pressure Ian into showing her mercy. Ian did not flinch. He did not shift his weight, blink rapidly, or look away from her streaking mascara and trembling lips. He let her scream and cry until she simply ran out of breath, her hysterical pleas dying awkwardly in the heavy, silent air of the living room. The 70 affluent guests watched in sheer fascination, utterly captivated by the raw, brutal unmasking of a high society marriage. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one offered a single word of support. When Ian finally spoke, his voice was not raised, but it carried a profound, devastating resonance that chilled the blood of everyone listening. He looked directly at the weeping woman he had once loved with his entire heart. He told her that he had spent the last 3 years defending her against every reasonable doubt. He had defended her expensive tastes, her relentless social climbing, and her constant subtle disrespect toward his own family because he believed she genuinely loved him. But he calmly stated that a man can only defend a marriage that actually exists in reality. Ian explained to her with brutal, microscopic precision exactly when their marriage had permanently died. He made it clear that their relationship did not die tonight in front of their wealthy friends. It did not die when she publicly humiliated his father at the front door. Ian stated that their marriage was completely, utterly destroyed the exact second she sat down in a dark room and meticulously practiced forging his legal signature. He told her that the moment she decided to steal his identity, violate his private business accounts, and leverage his future to fund her brother's criminal enterprise, she stopped being his wife. She instantly became a hostile domestic predator. He informed her that he was not going to defend a criminal who had actively tried to ruin his life and strip him of his life savings. He looked her dead in the eyes and coldly instructed her to stop wasting her 10 minutes, turn around, and go pack her single bag. The absolute, unyielding finality of his rejection hit her harder than any legal document. The last door had been slammed shut and locked. She was entirely and utterly alone. Ian's final rejection hung in the heavy air of the grand living room, a brutal and definitive end to a manufactured marriage. As his words settled over the massive estate, the spotlight shifted completely from the legal execution to the devastating social fallout. The elite crowd of 70 guests who had spent the entire evening drinking expensive champagne and flattering Valerie suddenly moved as a single unified organism. They physically stepped back. It was a synchronized, instinctual shrinking away from the epicenter of the disaster. In the ruthless world of high society, proximity to failure is considered a highly contagious disease. Proximity to federal fraud and severe criminal embezzlement is an absolute death sentence. The affluent millionaires no longer looked at Valerie with any trace of sympathy or pity. Pity was a luxury reserved for the unfortunate victims of circumstance. Valerie was not a victim. She was toxic. She was legally and socially radioactive. The wealthy men in their custom-tailored suits and the women in their imported silk gowns instinctively clutched their expensive belongings, ensuring there was a wide, undeniable gap of empty hardwood floor separating them from the disgraced hostess. They were rapidly calculating their own exposure, desperately hoping that drinking her stolen champagne and eating her catered caviar would not somehow earn them a federal subpoena from the Department of Justice. The departure began not with a loud announcement, but with a sudden, urgent whispering that swept through the crowd like a cold wind. Husbands leaned down to mutter sharply into the ears of their wives, their expressions tight with panic. Wives quickly grabbed their designer clutch purses from the marble side tables. There were no polite goodbyes offered. There were no fake promises to call her next week to catch up over coffee. The socialites simply turned their backs and initiated a rapid, highly determined march toward the heavy oak front doors. The grand foyer, which had been the site of my initial public humiliation just an hour prior, transformed instantly into a frantic evacuation zone. People pushed past each other to escape the burning building of her social standing. Even the head catering manager recognized the shifting tide of the evening. He signaled his waitstaff with a sharp, uncompromising wave of his hand. The servers immediately began collecting the remaining silver platters, scraping the uneaten gourmet food into black plastic bins, and quietly wheeling their insulated carts toward the service exit. They were cutting their financial losses and abandoning the sinking ship without asking for permission. Valerie stood frozen at the base of the grand mahogany staircase, watching the mass exodus in pure, unadulterated horror. She turned her head wildly from left to right, her bloodshot eyes wide and pleading desperately, hoping to catch a single sympathetic gaze. She found absolutely nothing but averted eyes, hardened faces, and accelerating footsteps heading for the driveway. Desperation is a powerful, deeply degrading force. As the crowd thinned out at a terrifying speed, Valerie spotted a familiar face lingering near the grand piano. It was a woman wearing an immaculate emerald green silk dress, a person Valerie had proudly introduced earlier as her absolute closest confidant in this exclusive neighborhood. They had spent the last 3 weeks touring luxury boutiques together, drinking imported mimosas at private clubs, and laughing carelessly at the working class. This specific woman had been the very first person to applaud and chuckle when Valerie mocked my charcoal suit at the start of the party. Valerie lunged forward, abandoning all remaining pretenses of dignity. Her expensive high heels clicked frantically against the polished floor as she closed the distance. She reached out with trembling hands to grab the woman by the smooth fabric of her emerald sleeve. Valerie began to beg. Her voice was a ragged, pathetic whisper completely stripped of its usual haughty, arrogant resonance. She pleaded for a safe place to stay just for tonight. She asked desperately for the use of a guest house, a spare bedroom, or even the small couch in her basement. She frantically tried to frame the catastrophic event as a temporary family misunderstanding, begging her wealthy friend to offer a quiet harbor until her lawyers could untangle the ridiculous criminal accusations. She promised it would only be for a few days, swearing she would repay the favor the moment she accessed her hidden accounts. The woman in the emerald dress did not offer a comforting embrace. She did not express a single ounce of sympathetic warmth toward her supposed best friend. She looked down at Valerie's trembling fingers, clutching her expensive silk sleeve, and physically recoiled, as if she had just been touched by a diseased animal. She roughly yanked her arm free, smoothing the wrinkled fabric with a look of profound, undisguised disgust. The wealthy elite do not maintain their pristine status by harboring exposed, bankrupt criminals. The woman looked Valerie directly in her weeping eyes and delivered a rejection so cold and absolute it practically dropped the temperature of the entire room. She stated in a harsh, clipped whisper that she could not possibly be associated with an active federal embezzlement investigation. She coldly reminded Valerie that her own husband sat on the executive board of a major banking institution. Harboring a fugitive guilty of severe wire fraud and document forgery would trigger an immediate corporate scandal that could ruin their own pristine reputation. There was no friendship here. There never had been. Their entire bond was built on the incredibly fragile foundation of stolen wealth and superficial suburban aesthetics. With the stolen money completely gone, the friendship instantly evaporated into thin air. The woman did not wait for a response from the weeping hostess. She turned her back completely on the ruined woman. She adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, lifted her chin with practiced, flawless arrogance, and walked rapidly toward the front exit. She did not look back over her shoulder a single time. She stepped out into the cool, dark night, marching directly toward her waiting luxury sedan. The heavy car door slammed shut, echoing loudly through the quiet neighborhood, leaving a devastating finality in its wake. Valerie stood watching the red taillights of her supposed best friend's vehicle fade down the long, manicured driveway. The brutal reality of high society loyalty had just been demonstrated with flawless cruelty. She was completely discarded, treated with the exact same merciless disdain she had so eagerly weaponized against me just a fraction of an hour ago. The massive living room was now entirely empty. The 70 affluent guests had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but discarded cocktail napkins and half-empty champagne flutes resting abandoned on the marble countertops. The live jazz band had packed their brass instruments and slipped out the back door without demanding their final payment, eager to escape the blast zone before the authorities arrived. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate suddenly felt incredibly hollow and vast. The high, vaulted ceilings no longer projected the sounds of cheerful, arrogant laughter or the clinking of imported crystal. They only amplified the heavy, suffocating silence of total, absolute ruin. Valerie stood completely isolated in the very center of the massive hardwood floor. She slowly turned in a slow, aimless circle, her eyes scanning the luxurious imported furniture, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the wide panoramic windows she had bragged about all evening. It had taken her 18 months of careful, meticulous deception to build her fraudulent empire. It had taken her exactly 45 minutes to lose absolutely everything. The timeline of her destruction was staggering to comprehend. Less than an hour ago, she was the undisputed queen of the suburbs, sipping premium champagne and mocking the man she thought was a helpless old laborer. Now she was an exposed federal criminal, entirely stripped of her finances, abandoned completely by her husband, and brutally discarded by her elite social circle. She was standing in the middle of a magnificent architectural masterpiece that she did not own breathing air. She could no longer afford to condition. Her legs finally gave out under the crushing, insurmountable weight of her absolute isolation. She dropped heavily to her knees on the polished floor, her ruined designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She pressed her face into her trembling hands, but no more tears came. She was entirely empty, drained of all defiance, arrogance, and hope. The magnificent, intelligent trap we had set had snapped shut with flawless, terrifying precision, and the crowd had delivered their final, devastating verdict by simply walking away. The grand show she had so desperately wanted to host was completely over, and she was the only remaining casualty on the empty stage. The heavy silence of the emptied estate was violently shattered by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the cool night air, casting frantic geometric shadows across the pristine imported windows of the massive house. Two heavily armored police cruisers tore up the long paved driveway and slammed into park, directly behind the idling tow truck. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, moving with intense tactical purpose. They did not knock on the heavy oak front doors. They strode straight across the threshold, their heavy-duty boots echoing loudly on the polished marble floors. Owen Gallagher stood waiting for them in the center of the grand foyer, holding a sleek leather folder. The brilliant corporate attorney stepped forward and handed the lead officer the highly expedited emergency eviction mandate he had secured from a federal judge just hours prior. The officer quickly scanned the heavy legal document, verifying the authorized signatures and the immediate execution clause. He gave Owen a single curt nod of absolute professional understanding. The tactical squad bypassed the grand staircase entirely and marched directly into the sprawling living room where the last 2 remaining criminals were waiting for their inevitable conclusion. Cameron was still curled into a pathetic, miserable ball against the base of the marble kitchen island. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was completely ruined, soaked through with cold terror sweat, and wrinkled beyond repair. He looked up with wide, bloodshot eyes as the heavy footsteps of the police officers stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. The lead officer demanded his legal identification in a booming, uncompromising voice. Cameron fumbled desperately through his jacket pockets, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped his leather wallet twice onto the hardwood floor. The officer snatched the wallet, pulled out the driver license, and called the information directly into his shoulder radio. The automated police dispatch system took less than 15 seconds to respond. The loud mechanical voice crackled clearly through the radio speaker, confirming an active, high-priority federal arrest warrant issued directly by the United States Department of Justice. The charges listed were severe interstate wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement related to his liquidated cryptocurrency enterprise. The officers did not offer Cameron a single moment to process the devastating reality of his new existence. 2 heavily built policemen grabbed him roughly by the shoulders and hauled him forcefully off the floor. They spun him around and slammed his chest hard against the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island he had been crying against. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed brutally through the empty vaulted ceilings. Cameron let out a pathetic, broken sob, pleading weakly with the officers that this was all a massive misunderstanding and that he was a wealthy technology visionary. The officers completely ignored his delusional babbling. They grabbed him by the biceps and marched him aggressively out of the living room, dragging him toward the flashing lights of the waiting patrol cars. The arrogant brother who had planned to steal an empire was now nothing more than a federally indicted prisoner being hauled away to a concrete cell. The lead officer then turned his cold, authoritative gaze entirely onto Valerie. She was still kneeling helplessly on the floor, surrounded by the scattered white pages of her ruined life. She stared at the spot where her brother had just been violently arrested, her brain utterly incapable of processing the sheer speed of their mutual destruction. The officer stepped forward and clearly informed her that she was currently standing on privately owned property without legal authorization. He articulated the exact parameters of the emergency eviction order secured by my corporate legal team. He told her she was required to vacate the premises immediately, pending the active federal forgery charges related to the fraudulent secondary mortgage she had attempted to secure. The officer stated that she was officially an unlawful trespasser, and if she did not comply with the immediate eviction mandate, she would be placed in steel handcuffs and dragged out to the patrol cars exactly like her brother. Owen Gallagher stepped forward and reminded the officer of the strict parameters I had previously established regarding her personal belongings. He legally clarified that every single expensive item inside the estate, including her designer luggage, her imported jewelry, and her luxury accessories, was now completely frozen by federal decree as evidence of marital embezzlement. Valerie was legally permitted to take nothing more than basic, everyday clothing. The officer pulled a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag from his tactical belt, a standard-issue item used for collecting crime scene evidence, and tossed it carelessly onto the floor at her feet. He gave her exactly 3 minutes to walk up the grand mahogany staircase, gather her basic garments, and return to the foyer. He warned her that a female officer would shadow her every single movement to ensure she did not attempt to steal any frozen assets on her way out. Valerie slowly picked up the ugly black plastic garbage bag with trembling, numb fingers. She pulled herself up from the floor using the wooden banister for physical support. Her ruined, expensive silk designer dress dragged pitifully behind her as she began the long, humiliating ascent up the grand staircase. She was flanked closely by a stern female police officer who watched her with absolute, undisguised contempt. 3 minutes later, Valerie emerged at the top of the landing. She looked completely broken. She dragged the heavy black plastic trash bag behind her, carrying a pathetic assortment of plain sweatpants, simple cotton shirts, and a pair of cheap running shoes. The absolute stark visual contrast between the magnificent, multi-million-dollar smart home she had tried to steal and the literal garbage bag holding her entire remaining net worth was devastatingly poetic. She descended the stairs slowly, the plastic bag thudding loudly against each imported wooden step. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she stopped and looked across the empty foyer. Ian was standing near the entryway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Valerie opened her mouth, trying to form one last desperate apology, one last manipulative plea for him to save her from the cold reality waiting outside the front doors. Ian did not let her speak a single word. He simply raised his right hand and pointed a single rigid finger directly toward the open doorway leading out into the dark night. He offered absolutely zero forgiveness and zero hesitation. His face was a mask of pure, impenetrable ice. He was completely done looking at the toxic parasite that had infected his life. The police officer grabbed Valerie firmly by the elbow and physically directed her toward the exit, forcing her to walk the final few feet out of the spectacular house she would never set foot inside again. I was already standing outside on the massive covered front porch, breathing in the crisp, cool night air. The heavy humidity of the evening had finally broken, leaving behind a perfectly clear sky. I stood with my hands resting casually in the pockets of my charcoal suit, watching the red and blue police lights wash over the pristine, manicured landscaping of my private property. The heavy oak front doors swung wide open, and Valerie was marched out onto the concrete steps. She stopped moving for a fraction of a second when she saw me standing there. She clutched the neck of the black plastic trash bag tightly to her chest, staring at me with hollow, defeated eyes. She was waiting for me to say something cruel. She was waiting for me to gloat, to mock her downfall, to deliver a final venomous monologue about how the old lawnmower had completely destroyed her arrogant life. I did not give her the satisfaction of a single spoken word. I did not frown. I did not smile. I simply stood there tall and resolute, projecting the absolute immovable power of a man who had successfully protected his family from a severe financial predator. I looked right through her as if she were completely invisible, as if she were nothing more than a mild, temporary inconvenience that had been permanently swept away. The absolute silence of my victory was infinitely more crushing than any insult I could have possibly hurled at her. The police officer nudged her shoulder sharply, forcing her to keep moving forward. Valerie stumbled down the concrete porch steps and began her long, agonizing march down the expansive paved driveway. The flashing strobe lights of the police cruisers illuminated every single pathetic step of her departure. She walked alone, dragging her heavy bag of basic clothing across the dark asphalt. The neighbors she had so desperately tried to impress were watching her complete destruction through the blinds of their own luxury homes. She had absolutely nowhere to go, no stolen money to hide behind, and no wealthy friends to save her. I watched her shrinking silhouette slowly disappear into the cold, unforgiving darkness of the suburban street, entirely erased from our lives forever. The flashing lights of the police cruisers finally disappeared at the end of the long driveway, swallowing the last physical trace of the chaos that had consumed the evening. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door, securing the entrance with a solid metallic click that echoed down the vast, empty hallway. The sprawling suburban fortress was completely silent now. The 70 affluent guests, the arrogant socialites, and the frantic catering staff were all gone. They had fled the premises like mice fleeing a sinking ship, leaving behind a massive trail of discarded cocktail napkins, half-empty champagne flutes, and shattered illusions. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, stepping carefully over the lingering debris of Valerie's ruined social empire. The imported marble floors no longer reverberated with the sound of her sharp, manicured heels or her piercing, condescending laughter. The house felt entirely different. It felt lighter. The suffocating, toxic pressure that had infected every single square inch of this magnificent property had been permanently eradicated. I found Ian standing quietly in the center of the massive kitchen. He had removed his tailored navy suit jacket and draped it carelessly over the back of a mahogany dining chair. He had loosened his silk tie and unbuttoned the top collar of his crisp white shirt. The rigid, impenetrable armor he had worn throughout the entire grueling execution of our legal trap was finally beginning to melt away. He looked exhausted, but the deep, dark shadows of anxiety that had plagued his eyes for the last 18 months were completely gone. I walked over to the kitchen island and stood beside him, looking out the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows that faced the expansive backyard. The automatic exterior lights bathed the manicured landscaping in a soft, warm, golden glow. I placed my heavy, calloused hand firmly on my son's shoulder. I gave it a slow, reassuring squeeze. He let out a long, trembling breath, releasing the final remnants of the tension he had been carrying inside his chest. He turned his head and gave me a small, genuine smile. It was the absolute first time I had seen him truly smile since the day he married that parasitic woman. He did not say a word. He simply gestured toward the heavy sliding glass doors leading out to the rear patio. I nodded in silent agreement. We walked out onto the massive stone terrace together. The cool, crisp night air washed over us instantly, clearing the lingering smell of expensive synthetic perfumes and catered seafood from my lungs. I walked over to the edge of the stone patio and rested my hands on the smooth, wrought iron railing. I looked out over the vast, pristine expanse of the backyard. The thick green grass was cut to absolute perfection. The heavy oak trees I had personally selected and planted along the perimeter swayed gently in the evening breeze. Valerie had called me an old lawnmower just hours ago, attempting to reduce my entire existence to dirt and manual labor. She was completely blind to the profound, majestic beauty of actually owning the earth you stand upon. She never understood that true power is rooted in the soil. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, pure scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. It was the greatest smell in the world. I heard the heavy clinking of glass behind me. I turned around and watched Ian walk over to a custom-built outdoor bar cabinet. He opened the dark wooden doors and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with a rich, dark amber liquid. It was a rare aged bourbon I had gifted him when he first broke ground on this specific property. He reached down and retrieved 2 heavy-bottomed crystal tumblers. He walked over to the thick teakwood table situated in the center of the patio and set the glasses down. He pulled the heavy glass stopper from the decanter and poured a generous measure of the dark liquor into each tumbler. The rich, smoky aroma of toasted oak and aged vanilla drifted immediately through the cool night air. It was a drink meant for men who understood the supreme value of patience, maturity, and quiet strength. It was the exact opposite of the cheap, flashy imported champagne Valerie had been practically bathing in all night. Ian picked up both glasses and walked over to where I was standing near the edge of the patio. He handed one of the heavy crystal tumblers to me. I wrapped my thick, working fingers around the cold glass, feeling the substantial, comforting weight of it in my palm. We stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the dark, quiet expanse of the property. The silence between us was not heavy or uncomfortable. It was the deep, profound silence of two men who had just fought a brutal war side by side and emerged completely victorious. Ian looked down at his glass, swirling the amber liquid, slowly watching the way it caught the soft golden light from the patio fixtures. He spoke with a voice that was quiet but incredibly steady. He told me he was deeply sorry for letting things get so dangerously out of control. He apologized for being so completely blind to her manipulation, for bringing a predator into our family, and for allowing her to treat me with such blatant, horrific disrespect. He said he felt like a fool for believing her lies, and for almost losing his entire financial future to a woman who only loved the numbers in his bank account. I stopped him right there. I turned to face him, looking him directly in his eyes. I told him there was absolutely no reason to apologize. I explained that predators like Valerie and Cameron succeed precisely because they prey on the goodness and the inherent trust of honest, hardworking people. I reminded him that he had married her because he possessed a generous, loving heart, and she had merely exploited his best qualities. I told him that a man is never defined by the mistakes he makes when he is acting in good faith. A man is entirely defined by how he chooses to respond the exact moment he discovers the truth. I pointed out that when confronted with the devastating reality of her absolute betrayal, he did not cower. He did not hide. He stood tall, he faced the fire, and he executed our defensive strategy with flawless, ruthless precision. I told him I had never been more incredibly proud to call him my son than I was tonight. Ian swallowed hard, nodding slowly, as my words settled deep into his chest. The remaining heavy burdens of guilt and shame evaporated completely from his posture. He raised his crystal tumbler, holding it out in the cool space between us. He proposed a toast to the absolute eradication of the toxic parasites that had tried to drain our livers. He toasted to the complete reclamation of his independence, his business, and his home. I raised my own heavy glass, meeting his tumbler in the air. The thick crystal clinked together with a sharp, clear ringing sound that resonated beautifully across the empty backyard. I toasted to the future, to a completely clean slate, and to the unbreakable, absolute bond of our family. I brought the heavy glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the aged bourbon. The dark liquor burned pleasantly all the way down my throat, leaving a warm, satisfying trail of smoky oak and rich caramel. It tasted like absolute victory. I turned my gaze back out toward the dark, sprawling acreage. The stars were shining incredibly bright against the pitch-black canvas of the night sky, free from the massive, glaring floodlights Valerie had constantly insisted on running. The absolute stillness of the property was deeply comforting. The air was finally clean, untainted by the toxic presence of greed and arrogance. I stood on my own land, sipping my own bourbon, standing next to a son who had truly become a man today. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling a profound sense of deep, unshakable peace wash over my entire soul. The incredibly complex, ruthless business of protecting our family had been firmly, totally, and permanently handled. I smiled into the dark, quiet night, knowing that the foundation of our lives was completely secure once again. The most profound lesson from this story is that true family is not defined merely by shared blood or years spent together, but by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and unconditional love. It teaches us that practicing kindness should never come at the cost of our own self-destruction. When the people we trust most choose greed, deception, and manipulation over love. The ultimate act of self-worth is having the courage to walk away. Ending a toxic family dynamic isn't a loss. It is a vital liberation. We are never too old to demand dignity, set firm boundaries, and rewrite our own story. If this story empowered you to stand up for your own dignity, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below.